Welcome to another deep dive.
Mm.
Today we're going to be looking at the climate situation in Asia and the Pacific,
Okay.
specifically focusing on greenhouse gas emissions
So,
and this concept of just transition.
all right.
We've got excerpts from a 2023 UN report.
Okay.
The title is 2023 Review of Climate Ambition in Asia and the Pacific. Just transition towards regional net zero climate resilient development.
Oh, it's a mouthful.
It is a mouthful.
Yeah,
But the content is even more fascinating, so get ready for some eye-opening facts
I'm ready.
about what's happening in this really crucial region.
You know, the Asia-Pacific region is such a diverse place. It's really like a puzzle box when you think about it.
What do you mean?
We've got these economic giants like China and Japan,
Right.
but also tiny island nations that are super vulnerable to climate change.
Yeah, that's true.
You've got these massive industrial hubs, but also these vast agricultural landscapes. And to understand the climate picture, you need to see how all these pieces fit together.
And that's what this report helps us do, right?
Exactly.
It dives deep into these emissions, analyzes natural carbon sinks like mangroves and forests, and explores how to move towards a low-carbon future in a way that's fair for everyone.
Right, a just transition.
Right, so let's start with the current state of emissions in the region.
Sure.
What's the big takeaway there?
Well, it's a bit of a mixed bag, to be honest.
Okay.
A lot of countries in the region are stepping up. You know, they're making pledges for carbon neutrality,
Sure.
setting targets and revising their climate plans, which is great.
That's good.
But the catch is, even with all these efforts, the region isn't quite on track to meet the Paris Agreement's goal,
Which is?
limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. You know,
Yeah.
it's a big challenge.
I mean, is this approach of setting targets based on kind of like a business as usual scenario?
not
Is
that-
that really effective? I mean, shouldn't they be basing their targets on, real data, not just projections?
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Okay.
The report actually points this out, that a lot of nations are basing their commitments on these business as usual scenarios.
So they're kind of predicting emissions based on current trends.
Right, and that can lead to underestimating the problem and setting less ambitious goals.
Like setting your fitness goals based on how much you're currently sitting on the couch.
Exactly.
Not going to get you very far.
Not at all.
And during the pandemic, emissions actually decreased in many parts of the world due to lockdowns and reduced economic activity.
Right.
Does that happen in the Asia-Pacific region too?
Well, it did in some nations,
Okay.
but it wasn't a universal trend.
Interesting.
Some countries actually saw their emissions increase during that period.
Oh, wow. So it's not as straightforward as you might think.
Definitely not.
It really underscores just how complex this region is.
Absolutely.
So COVID-19 gave us maybe like a temporary glimpse of what reduced emissions could look like,
Yeah, sort of like a sneak peek.
but it's not a sustainable solution long term.
Nope.
Now, shifting gears a bit,
Sure.
the report talks a lot about mangroves.
Yeah, mangroves are fascinating.
They are. I know they're these coastal forests, but why are they so important in this whole conversation about climate change?
Well, mangroves are like these incredible carbon sinks.
Okay.
They absorb huge amounts of CO2 from the atmosphere, way more than like typical forests.
Wow, really?
Yeah, and they act as natural barriers, protecting coastlines from storms and erosion.
So they're like a multi-tool of environmental benefits.
Exactly.
But I also read that the Asia-Pacific region is responsible for something like 70% of global carbon loss from mangrove deforestation.
It's a staggering statistic.
Over the past 25 years, I mean, that's crazy.
Yeah, it is.
So what's being done to address this?
Well, there are restoration efforts happening across the region.
Yeah.
You know, countries are planting new mangroves
Okay.
and protecting existing ones.
That's good.
But the success of these efforts has been a bit inconsistent.
Really?
Yeah, sometimes the restoration projects are poorly planned, or they don't involve the local communities who depend on those mangroves.
So it's not just about planting trees, it's about understanding the whole ecosystem.
Right, and working with the people who live there.
Yeah, makes sense. Speaking of trees, let's move on to forests.
Okay.
What's the situation with forest cover in the Asia-Pacific region?
This is where things get a bit more optimistic, although still complex.
Okay.
Overall, forest cover in the region has actually increased.
Really? I thought deforestation was a global crisis.
It is, but certain countries like China and Australia have seen big increases in forest area.
Interesting. So it's not all bad news,
Not entirely.
but I'm guessing there's a catch.
Well, much of this increase is from planted forest, not naturally regenerating ones.
So it's like comparing a carefully curated garden to a wild jungle.
Exactly.
The jungle might be messier, but it's teeming with life and resilience.
And biodiversity, which is crucial.
Right, so it's about quality, not just quantity.
Exactly. And we can't forget about protecting those existing old-growth forests.
The carbon storage powerhouses.
Exactly. They're irreplaceable.
So the report emphasizes that while deforestation emissions might be stabilizing, protecting those primary forests needs to be a top priority.
Absolutely.
Now let's talk about another land use trend tied to China and India.
Yeah.
Cropland expansion.
Right.
What's driving that?
Well, population growth.
Of course.
As the populations of China and India keep rising, so does the demand for food, which means more land is being converted for agriculture.
Well, people need to eat.
Of course.
Is that necessarily a bad thing?
It's complicated.
Okay.
While feeding a growing population is essential, the problem is that this expansion often comes at the expense of natural vegetation,
Leading to?
habitat loss, and biodiversity decline. It's a tough balancing act.
Yeah, I can see that.
And the report adds another layer of complexity to this.
Okay.
Apparently, in some countries, we're actually seeing cropland abandonment.
Cropland abandonment. That's interesting what's causing that.
It's a mix of things.
Like what?
Rural outmigration, urbanization, and even climate change itself.
Oh.
Making some areas less suitable for agriculture.
So it's like this giant land use puzzle, figuring out how to manage these different pieces in the most sustainable way.
Exactly, and this raises some interesting questions.
Such as?
How is this impacting emissions? Can we repurpose abandoned cropland for things like reforestation or renewable energy projects?
Lots to think about.
Definitely.
So we've talked about emissions, mangroves, forests, and cropland.
Yeah.
What's the final piece of this puzzle that the report explores?
It's the idea of a just transition.
Okay, so let's dive into that.
Right.
What does just transition actually mean in the context of climate change?
Well, we can't just suddenly slam the brakes on the old economy and expect everyone to magically adapt, right?
Right.
A just transition is about making sure no one gets left behind as we move to a greener future.
Okay.
It recognizes that this shift to a low-carbon economy needs to be fair.
Fair for everyone.
Yes, especially for workers in industries that are being phased out, like fossil fuels, and for communities that are most vulnerable to climate change.
So it's about making sure everyone benefits from this green economy, not just the select few.
Exactly.
But how does that actually play out in the real world? Like, what are some examples of a just transition in action?
So let's take the energy sector.
Okay.
A just transition would involve phasing out those coal-fired power plants.
Which are big emitters.
Huge emitters, and at the same time, investing in renewable energy sources, like solar and wind.
That makes sense.
But what happens to the workers in those coal plants?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Right? A just transition wouldn't just shut down those plants and leave people stranded.
Right.
It would include things like retraining programs
Oh, okay.
to give them skills they need for jobs in the renewable energy sector.
So they could learn how to install solar panels or maintain wind turbines?
Exactly. Those are skills in high demand as we shift to renewables.
That makes sense, but wouldn't this require a massive investment?
Absolutely.
And who's going to pay for all this retraining and support?
That's a big question. And that's where financing a just transition, particularly in developing countries, gets really tricky.
Yeah, I can imagine.
We need creative financial mechanisms, partnerships between governments and the private sector, and maybe even a global green fund to support these efforts.
It sounds like we need to completely rethink our economic systems.
I think you're right.
It's not just about swapping out coal for solar panels, it's about changing how we value labor resources and the environment.
Absolutely. It's a fundamental shift in our thinking.
And it's not just about jobs and economics either.
Right.
The just transition also needs to address social inequalities, especially gender inequality.
Absolutely, because women are often disproportionately affected by climate change.
Right. They're the ones fetching water, tending crops, caring for families when disaster strikes.
Exactly, and yet they're often excluded from decision-making and lack access to resources and opportunities.
So how do we make sure a just transition empowers women and doesn't make existing inequalities worse?
That's a key question. We need to make sure women have equal access to education training and green jobs.
Okay.
We need to support women-led businesses and initiatives that are focused on sustainable solutions.
Yeah.
And crucially, women need to be at the table when climate policies are being developed and implemented.
It can't be a top-down approach.
Exactly. It has to be inclusive,
Involving everyone.
from policymakers to grassroots communities.
And this brings us back to the importance of local context.
Right. What works in one country or community might not work in another.
A just transition isn't about imposing these prepackaged solutions.
It's about working with communities to find solutions that fit their specific needs.
The UN report highlights some case studies of countries that are dealing with these just transition challenges.
It does.
Are there any success stories or promising approaches that stand out to you?
There are a few.
Tell me about them.
For example, in Bangladesh, they have a program to help communities adapt to rising sea levels.
Okay.
They're providing training in things like aquaculture and salt-tolerant crops, so people can transition away from traditional livelihoods that are becoming more and more vulnerable because of climate change.
That's a great example of how a just transition can build resilience and empower communities.
Right. And then in India, they're investing heavily in renewable energy, particularly solar power.
Okay.
They're creating tons of green jobs and providing clean energy to millions of people, all while reducing their reliance on fossil fuels.
That's encouraging to hear.
It shows that a just transition is actually happening.
It's not just some abstract idea.
Right. It's making a real difference in people's lives.
But it's a journey, right?
Absolutely.
It's not like we achieve a just transition and then we're done.
It's an ongoing process.
We need to constantly monitor progress, evaluate outcomes, and be willing to adapt along the way.
Exactly. It's about continuous learning, collaboration, and a commitment to leaving no one behind.
This deep dive has really highlighted how interconnected these issues are.
It's all connected.
From emissions to mangroves to land use to this whole idea of a just transition.
It's a complex.
It's a lot to think about.
It is, but it's important to understand these connections.
I'm eager to learn more.
Well, there's a lot more to unpack. We'll go deeper into the details of a just transition and what it means for you after a quick break.
So we're back, and I want to keep digging into this whole just transition thing.
Yeah, it's a really important concept.
It is. So we know that the shift to a low-carbon future needs to happen, but it can't just benefit the lucky few.
Exactly. It has to be fair for everyone.
For everyone. And that's where the real challenges lie.
And the opportunities.
Yeah, true. So one of the big things with a just transition is making sure those people whose jobs depend on industries like fossil fuels aren't forgotten.
Right.
You mentioned retraining programs and financial support earlier, but can you give us some more concrete examples?
Sure. Imagine you're a coal miner in Indonesia.
Okay.
Your whole life is revolved around this industry, and then suddenly the world says coal needs to go.
Right.
A just transition would make sure you're not left high and dry. Maybe you're offered training to install solar panels or learn how to maintain wind turbines.
Skills that are in high demand as we shift to renewables.
Exactly.
But wouldn't that require a ton of money? Who's going to pay for all this retraining and support?
That's a major hurdle.
Yeah.
Financing a just transition, especially in developing countries.
Right.
It's going to take innovative financial mechanisms, partnerships between governments and the private sector, maybe even a global green fund.
Sounds like we need a whole new way of thinking about our economic systems.
Yeah, kind of a paradigm shift.
It's not just about replacing coal with solar panels. It's about changing how we value things like labor and resources and the environment.
You got it.
And we can't forget about social inequality.
Definitely not.
Especially when it comes to gender.
You're right. Women are often hit hardest by climate change.
They're the ones taking care of families dealing with droughts and floods.
Absolutely. And they're often excluded from decision-making and don't have access to resources.
So how do we make sure this just transition actually empowers women?
Well, for starters, women need equal access to education and training and green jobs.
Makes sense.
We need to support businesses and initiatives led by women that are focused on sustainable solutions.
Okay.
And most importantly, women need to have a voice when climate policies are being made.
So it's not just about telling people what to do.
Right. It has to be a collaborative process.
Involving everyone.
And that brings us back to the importance of thinking about the local context.
Yeah, what works in one place might not work in another.
Exactly. A just transition isn't about forcing cookie-cutter solutions on communities.
It's about working with them to find what fits their needs.
Right.
The UN report had some case studies of countries dealing with these just transition challenges. Any that really stood out to you?
Yeah, there were a few.
Like?
Well, in Bangladesh, they've got a program to help people adapt to rising sea levels.
Okay.
They're providing training in aquaculture and teaching people how to grow salt-tolerant crops, so folks can move away from traditional ways of making a living that are becoming less and less viable because of climate change.
So it's about helping people adapt and find new opportunities.
Exactly, building resilience.
What about other examples?
India is investing a lot in renewable energy, especially solar power.
Okay.
They're creating a bunch of green jobs, providing clean energy to millions of people, and becoming less dependent on fossil fuels.
Those are some pretty positive examples.
They are. It shows that a just transition isn't just some pie-in-the-sky idea
It's actually happening.
and making a difference, but it's a process.
An ongoing process.
We need to constantly check our progress, see what's working, what's not, and be willing to change course if we need to.
Always learning and adapting.
And always remembering that no one should be left behind.
That's a good point. This has been really insightful.
Glad to hear it.
We've covered so much about this just transition.
Yeah, from jobs to gender equality to the importance of considering local contexts.
But how does all of this relate back to our listener?
That's the key question, isn't it?
What can people actually do in their own lives to be part of this movement toward a just and sustainable future?
Well, it's easy to feel overwhelmed by the scale of it all.
Definitely.
Like our individual actions don't really matter.
Like a drop in the ocean?
But remember, oceans are made of drops.
True.
Collective action starts with individual awareness.
So just listening to this deep dive is a good first step.
Absolutely. It's all about educating ourselves.
Okay, so we need to learn about the issues.
But knowledge without action is like a car without an engine.
It won't get us very far.
So what can we actually do? Think about your daily choices.
Like?
The products you buy, the food you eat, the clothes you wear, even how you get around.
Okay.
Those little decisions can have a big impact.
It's like voting with your wallet?
Exactly. Support businesses that are committed to sustainability and ethical practices.
Look for companies that are transparent about their supply chains and treat their workers fairly.
Right? And don't forget about supporting local businesses that are doing good things in your community.
We can also talk about these issues with our friends and family, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Every conversation is a chance to spread awareness.
And inspire action.
Don't underestimate the power of those conversations.
You can also get involved with organizations working on climate justice and sustainability in the Asia-Pacific region.
There are so many amazing groups out there.
Find one that speaks to you and contribute.
Whether it's donating, volunteering, or just helping them get the word out.
You mentioned earlier that financing a just transition in developing countries is a big challenge.
Yeah.
Can individuals help with that?
Absolutely.
How?
You can support organizations that are working to raise money for a just transition. Look for investment opportunities that align with your values.
Like green bonds or community-owned renewable energy projects.
Exactly.
It sounds like there's so many ways to get involved.
There are.
From being mindful consumers to supporting advocacy groups to actually becoming champions for just transition efforts.
Every action, no matter how small, adds to the momentum.
It's about changing how we think, how we act, and demanding a better future.
We need everyone to demand a just and sustainable future for the Asia-Pacific region and the whole world.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one thing you really want our listeners to remember?
The Asia-Pacific region is at a crossroads.
Okay.
It's facing huge challenges because of climate change,
Yeah.
but it's also a place of incredible innovation and resilience.
It's a region of contrast.
The decisions made there in the next few years will have a huge impact on everyone.
Globally.
And those decisions aren't just being made by governments and big companies.
Right.
They're also being shaped by people like you listening right now.
Wow. It's both exciting and a little scary to think that we all have a role to play.
The future's being written right now.
Right now.
And every action we take, every conversation we have, every choice we make is helping to write it.
What a powerful thought to end on. Thanks for guiding us through this complex and important topic.
You're welcome.
And to our listener, we hope this deep dive has not only informed you, but also inspired you to take action. Remember, the path toward a sustainable future is a marathon, not a sprint.
Right.
And every step we take together brings us closer to that goal.
Okay, so we've covered a ton in this deep dive. You know, emissions in the Asia-Pacific region.
Yeah.
The importance of those natural carbon sinks like mangroves.
Right.
And this whole idea of a just transition. It's clear that what happens over there in Asia
Yeah.
impacts the whole world.
Absolutely.
But how does all of this relate back to us? You know,
Yeah.
what can we actually do to help make things more sustainable over there?
It's easy to feel kind of overwhelmed by like the size of the problem.
Right, totally.
Like what I do doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
But all those little things we do actually add up.
So it's not just about governments and big companies.
No, not at all.
Individuals can make a difference too.
Everyone has a role to play.
So what can we actually do?
Well, just being aware of the issues is a good first step. Like listening to this deep dive.
Exactly.
Okay, but what about concrete actions?
Think about the choices you make every day.
Like what I buy at the grocery store,
Yeah, the products you buy, the food you eat.
the clothes I wear.
Exactly. And even how you travel.
Okay.
All of that has an impact.
So it's kind of like voting with your wallet.
Exactly. Support businesses that are trying to do things the right way.
The ones that care about the planet.
Yeah. And treat their workers fairly.
And don't forget about local businesses.
Right, supporting those local folks who are committed to sustainability.
It's about making those choices consciously.
It all adds up.
And we can talk about these issues with our friends and family too, right?
Absolutely. Every conversation can help raise awareness.
And hopefully inspire others to take action.
You never know who you might influence.
You mentioned earlier that financing a just transition, especially in developing countries, is a big challenge.
That's a huge hurdle.
Can individuals help with that?
Of course you can support those groups working to raise money for a just transition. Okay. Maybe look for investment opportunities that align with your values.
Things like green bonds or community-owned renewable energy projects.
Exactly. There are options out there.
So many ways to get involved.
From changing our own habits, to supporting those working on the front lines, to pushing for systemic change.
It's all connected.
Every little bit helps.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one thing you really want our listeners to take away from all of this?
The Asia-Pacific region is at a turning point.
Okay.
They're facing some really serious challenges because of climate change.
Yeah.
But it's also a region full of incredible innovation and resilience.
It's a region of contrasts, for sure.
And the decisions made there in the next few years are going to impact all of us.
Wow.
But those decisions aren't just being made by governments and corporations.
So it's not just up to them.
It's up to all of us, every single person listening right now.
That's both empowering and a little bit daunting.
It is, but it's the truth.
So what can we do?
Well, the future is being written right now. And every action we take, every conversation we have, every choice we make helps to write it.
What a powerful thought.
It's true.
It really is. Thanks for walking us through all of this.
You're welcome.
It's been really insightful. And to our listeners, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Remember, even small actions can make a big difference.
Keep learning, keep talking, keep pushing for a better future.
We're all in this together.